welcome to another episode of Sustainable Sustainability, where we talk to steward leaders who are either creating profitable solutions to today's environmental or social problems or shedding light on how we can do so. Today, I have a very special guest on the show with me, Ilian Mihov, noted economist and former dean of INSEAD. In fact, he has been the longest serving dean of INSEAD, over 10 years in total, and spent about 28 years at INSEAD so far. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Ilian, to begin with, tell us, what have you been doing since you stepped down from the deanship?
Yes, so I stepped down on 31st of August last year, and since then I have been on sabbatical. This academic year that just passed, I spent my sabbatical at Stanford University in California because I served 10 years, so for every 5 years you get 1 year sabbatical. So I have a second one now coming, which I will spend between MIT and Stanford.
Very good, very good. So as you know, in this podcast, we explore the idea of doing well by doing good and feature anybody that is actually profitably solving today's existential challenges. I wanted to talk to you particularly about the S of ESG today, given your research. And I want to particularly dive into two pieces of your research. One is on the economic development of countries, on which you've talked about quite a bit and written quite a bit. And the other is about the decline of democracy worldwide that you talk about. So maybe we start with the first one first. Give us, in very simple terms, the gist of your research on the economic growth of countries.
So I'm focusing on a very specific issue, and that is how some countries grow initially and then stop growing around the middle income, around the levels that are not now known as middle income trap. With one of my co-authors, we're trying to understand how actually they manage this growth and why, at some point they stop around $25,000 in terms of income per capita and international dollars. And I think that the interesting thing from the data is to see that the key variable that plays a role is institutions, the institutional environment in the country, rule of law, control of corruption, and so on. And we realize that there is not a single country that has more than, let's say, $40,000 income per capita. Well, the US is at 80,000. The rich countries are between, let's say, 60 and 100,000. So there is not a single country that is more than 40,000 income per capita and has poor quality institutions. So once you reach that level, if you have not reformed your institutions already, you have to do something like that.
So you call it the Great Wall, which is the middle income trap that they get stuck in. So why do they hit that wall?
So I call it the wall because one of my students in 2005 actually asked me a question after like 2 hours or 3 hours of lecturing.
Yes.
He said, okay, you talk a lot about institutions and, democracy, political stability. And if institutions are so important, why is China growing? So, to me, that was an interesting question, and I did not know the answer at the time. So I started looking at this, and I realized that then there is this area where countries stop growing unless they reform their institutions. I call it the wall because initially it was triggered by a discussion of China. So what is interesting is that before that level, before $25,000, let's just say $25,000 in the 2021 dollars, before that level, countries can grow simply by accumulation of factors of production, which are capital and labor. In other words, in plain words, just build factories and mobilize people to work.
And perhaps emulate the innovation that has happened in the high-income countries and use cheaper labor to deliver it.
Yes, exactly.
So that would explain the hockey stick curve that these countries experience in your research.
Yeah, but not all countries actually have this. So you still have to do several things right, but you don't have to reform your institutions.
Gotcha.
Because you just accumulate factors of production. But if you reach this level, then the way that you combine capital and labor, what we call productivity, the way that this productivity matters a lot. So innovation starts becoming more and more important. And if you don't have the right environment, it's very difficult to realize this. It's very difficult to create complex value chains with a lot of different suppliers and so on. And then you start stagnating.
So in other words, at some point, the cost advantage and the efficiencies other than institutions sort of level off, and then you get stuck in that trap. Yeah. So we've talked about institutions quite a bit, and I believe there are 6 institutions. Talk to us a little bit more about those.
So there are a lot of measures of institutions out there. I just stick with the original data that I got in 2006 from the World Bank, called the World Governance Indicators. And there are 6 there. They're actually drawn from a lot of other sources. So the first one is voice and accountability, which is a measure of democracy. So
freedom of speech.
Yes, the voice of the public in electing their government and the accountability of the politicians.
Okay.
The second one is control of corruption, which obviously it means, people understand what it means. Quality of regulation is also very important. Then the fourth one is government effectiveness. Then we have political stability, basically absence of political violence and unrest and so on. And the final one, which actually turns out to be very important, is the rule of law. So basically contract enforcement, how courts are working, and so on.
So again, it's these 6 institutions that you have to strengthen continuously if you want to go past the wall. And that explains why many countries, while they came within striking distance of the US or the richest countries, haven't crossed it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and China?
So that's the big question. I don't know how many $1 trillion, maybe $18 trillion question today. And it is, the question is, China, when I started looking at it, and I had a talk in Beijing in 2007, China was pretty far from the wall, from that level at the time. Today, China has just entered the zone that is sometimes called the middle income trap. So it's 20,000 plus. And it is the biggest question is, will China reform in order to start improving its institutions and therefore facilitating further growth, or will they stagnate and get stuck at the wall? Of course, sometimes people say, well, China is different and, they don't need these institutions. They have figured out what to do, how to do things. We don't know what they're doing.
But they're still in the middle income trap.
But still some people argue, don't worry about this middle income trap. They will be able to go through this trap and grow and become a rich country with this quality of institutions. Just for the viewers, the institutions are usually, they're ranked, they're measured from -2 to +2. So they're, basically standardized. So 0 is kind of like the average. So China today is probably at about -0.5. So it is below the average. And it's at that level, so anybody below 0, it's difficult to move. So my view is that China still has some probably room to grow within that gray area, the middle income trap, reaching 30, maybe even 32, 33,000. But as we can see already, there are issues. There are there are signs that may not continue easily. Now, my personal view for many years was that once China reaches the wall, and if it starts, shaking, then things will start changing. Sometimes when I say this, people think, but are you talking about democracy and the Communist Party rule and all these things? To be honest, the most important thing is not that. The most important, in my view, of these institutions is the rule of law. Because the rule of law is about contract enforcement. And contract enforcement is important because to create value, to be rich, it means that you produce in a short period of time a lot of value. But in the rich countries, it's not like people produce the whole thing. Usually they specialize in something very small, they become very efficient, and then they combine these individual tasks into a final product between different companies. And if you have contract enforcement, you know that you'll be able to create this long value chain and still deliver. But if you don't have contract enforcement and your suppliers do not deliver, then you start thinking, maybe I should start producing it myself. And that creates
because you can't rely on the ecosystem anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like you said, some people think that China is different. But what about other Asian countries? Your views on other big countries like Indonesia, India?
Well, they're very far still from the wall, and China is moving quite rapidly. I think that India has a little bit better readings in democracy, but on political stability, on some other of these issues, they're a little bit behind. I think that for all of them, the thing is the same.
It's the same. The institutions.
Yes.
Got it.
It's actually very interesting. Over the last year, I've been looking at this a lot. So I decided to look at the trajectory of South Korea, how it was growing like China initially without changing institutions, with low quality institutions. I have not looked exactly at what changed. And then at some point, you can see institutions changing and going through the wall, reforming and going through the wall and becoming, a rich country today, a high-income country. So it is possible to give examples in the region. I mean, Singapore, of course, is a great example as well. But it's possible to give examples where you can see countries reforming and growing.
Got it. Very good. Okay, let's turn now to the other interesting research, which is about democracies are on the decline worldwide. Give us a quick soundbite on that.
Well, there was so many books published on this in recent years. Of course, the first book that I should cite is Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, and The Last Man. That's the whole title, which was published, I think, in 1992. But basically, Fukuyama was arguing that history is not about events. History is about the clash of ideas, about ideology. And, there was communism, fascism, there were all kinds of, different regimes. But the Western liberal societies, the Western liberalism won at the end in 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And therefore, from now on, it's just basically one of these regimes will be dominant. Unfortunately, in the last few years, we have seen that that's not true. So there is still a clash of ideologies. And especially in more recent years, you can see aristocracies like Russia and, the non-democratic states like China and so on, moving, becoming richer and richer. So people started talking about the demise of democracy, also in the Western societies, but also the increase in the rest of the world. Now, last year, in one of the seminars at Stanford, I listened to a paper by Daniel Treisman, who is a professor of political science at University of California, Los Angeles. And he presented a paper that shows exactly the opposite, that basically shows that the number of democracies from 1900, over the last 120 years, has been increasing steadily, reaching a peak at some point in 2000. And then there is a small decline, but we're still above what he called the heyday of democracies, which was the 1990s. And then I looked at this, and a lot of people in the audience were a little bit in disagreement with this. I looked at this, and interestingly, 2 weeks before that, without knowing about the paper, I had created my own index of democracy for the world. So imagine that every country has an indicator from 0 to 1 on how democratic it is, whether it's electoral democracy or liberal democracy. So there are two different indicators. And then I decided that in order to understand where the world is heading, I don't need the number of democracies, because the fact that Aruba is a democracy and Russia is not does not help me very much, because the size and the impact is very different. So my indicator is putting a weight on every single reading. Then the weight is basically the share in world GDP. So small countries have small weight, big countries like China have big weight.
What about share of population?
So that's another indicator. Somebody actually in the audience was suggesting that. But I think that economic power is determining where the world is heading. So the indicator I constructed from 1960 until 2023, and it's very, very interesting. 60s and the 70s, basically we have a flat reading. Then in the 70s, the indicator starts increasing, not because there are more democracies, but because it turns out at that time that the West is growing very rapidly while the Soviet Union was stagnating.
It's collapsing, yeah.
Yeah, referring to the previous conversations that we had, actually the Soviet Union collapsed exactly at the wall, at the middle income trap. So it was already hitting the wall at the times, staying behind, while the Western world was growing. And the indicator, my indicator, was increasing. And I would say that this increase actually led to the changes in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet bloc, because the West was becoming so powerful. And then, of course, there's further increase in the indicator because East European countries became democratic. And the peak is in 1999. Since then, the indicator is going down.
Globally,
the global indicator of democracy. So again, this is just one indicator for the world, is going down. And today we are at the same level as we were in the 1970s during the Cold War. I think that this is important because it will create dynamics that are very different from what we have observed in the years since 1990. The non-democratic and autocratic states are becoming much more powerful. I think that the growth in China, which was engineered very well by the government, gave confidence to a lot of other rulers and countries around the world to say, look at China, we can grow without necessarily having the same kind of like democratic societies like the Western.
I was just going to say, so if China pulled out so many millions of people out of poverty, a lot of people might say, what's wrong with that kind of autocracy?
And I think that it's a good question, but again, it's not, first, let's see in the next 5-10 years whether China manages to continue growing. But, we value democracy not just because it gives you higher income per capita, higher wealth, which, basically does, but there
It's
are a
also
lot of
about
other...
freedom.
It's about freedom, it's about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. It's about, being yourself and not trying
Human
to...
dignity, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
So-
I get that. But a lot of people make that argument, though.
Yeah,
That it's a trade-off, right, in some countries. Coming back to the decline in the indicator, in the democracy indicator, the global indicator, does the increase, so you were comparing from 1970, you said, 60, and until now. But global population has doubled since then.
Yeah.
So does that have something to do with it, you think?
It could in general, because population is, more population should be creating more GDP. But fundamentally, I think that it was coming from, especially after the 2000s, it's not so much the population growth, but the Chinese population is even shrinking. I mean, not growing at the...
But global population is increased.
It's true. And I think that, again, the GDP of the countries where population is increasing very fast is not necessarily increasing as fast. So there are a lot of countries in Africa that have even positive population growth and negative GDP growth. So my indicator is really measuring economic power. But I completely agree that it will be good to create also this indicator by using population share rather than just economic share. I mean, each one of these indicators give you different perspective on the world. So if you ask the question, tomorrow we have a vote in the United Nations and every country has one country, one vote, then the number of democracies matters.
Yeah, that's true. No, I was just wondering whether, the fact that the democracy indicator is going south has anything to do with increasing population.
Yeah.
That we are now 8.1 billion people. Does that have anything to do with democracy going down because it is that much harder to manage a population of 8 billion versus 4 billion? and in countries which are highly populous anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually a very interesting hypothesis to see
Don't know
whether.
this,
But it is very easy to check this because we can see what is happening in the countries with a higher population growth. Is their weight increasing in the GDP or not? It's so in the indicator. In the population indicator, if you construct it with population shared weight, it basically will ask the question, on average, how many people live in a democratic society? What is the average reading of the, let's say, 50% or 30% and so on, which is a different question.
Yes, it is. And then I wonder whether the fact that in many countries, populations are getting very polarized, ideologically polarized, like in the US, you're either left or right, or India, for example, very, very polarized.
Yeah.
Does that have anything to do with it? Would be another interesting one to look at, I guess.
It is actually true. And I looked at some of these things. So I tried to decompose the decline. And of course, the first hypothesis is the rise of China. China has become so powerful economically. And China, we know that they practice geoeconomic power. So geoeconomics now has become one of the big topics in research. So geoeconomics is about using your economic relationships or economic power in order to achieve political or even economic goals as well. But it is using this power. It's not geopolitical power. And we know that China has a lot of relationships with a lot of countries that are going beyond just the economic agreements. So that's it's interesting where this will end. But as I was saying, I was looking at the decline of the indicator. If you remove China and the United States, so because the two big countries, the indicator still goes down.
Going south.
And it goes down not to, let's say, right now the reading is between 0 and 1, so it's 0.3. It will be something like 0.5 or so, but it has gone down quite significantly.
Interesting. So, in our own research at Stewardship Asia, where we look at business organizations, and we find that there are two types, given the current climate. Those that are profiting from today's existential challenges like climate change and social inequality, and those who are finding profitable solutions to these challenges. From your research, it seems like it's true for countries and governments too. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I think that there are definitely governments that try to figure out how to solve the problem and how to solve the problem in a sustainable way, meaning that through market forces and creating environments for profitable enterprises.
هذا أنت تترك نكهة تنير الطريق ليشرق حلمك ويستفيق. تسجل وصفة للنجاح تعيدها بشغف كل صباح. البنك العربي، الوصول بداية.
رمضان مع LCY كيكي. أشيك تفصيلة.
When I think around the world, which are these countries? Where do you see this most clearly? I would say that probably the Nordics, like Denmark, Sweden. These countries are so passionate about finding solutions to climate change. I think that Singapore in the last I don't know how many years also has been focusing more and more into in sustainability and climate change, addressing it and trying to figure out how can we make it here to be a profitable enterprise. Because if it is just government regulation or if it's taxation and so on, and companies do not believe in this, or they're not profitable, they're losing money, eventually they'll figure out how to circumvent this.
And there'll be no innovation.
Yeah.
And that's what we need, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. So in today's context, where humanity is literally sort of fighting for survival against the environment, against social forces, inequality is at its highest. What advice do you have for political leaders, particularly in developing countries?
Well, It's a very difficult question.
Because in many of the developing countries, particularly in Asia and Africa, we have this habit of saying, "Oh, the problem was created by the West, and now they're lecturing us." And those solutions for ESG don't actually apply to us, because when we try to solve a E problem the way the West is trying to address it, we create S problems. So don't lecture us, etc. So what would you?
I mean, these things are true. I mean, these arguments are not necessarily wrong. That first of all, if you look at the carbon dioxide emissions over the last 200 years, it is true that still most of the build-up is due to the United States and Europe, whether it is EU or the whole of Europe, it doesn't matter. But these three regions, EU, Europe outside of EU, and the US, have contributed the most. China probably will overtake them in the next, it depends how fast they continue increasing emissions, but in the next 20 years, for sure, if they just continue at the same level that they are today, they don't increase. And as we know, they've been increasing it. So it is true that the West has a lot to do in order to remove this carbon, but also I think that they are doing it. So if you look at the emissions in Europe, they have been going down since the 1990s. And it's now, what can a government in a developing country do? Well, it depends a lot on the country. There is no one single solution. It's not.
Yes.
There's no prescription. If we try to give so you have to look at the country. Where are the bottlenecks? What are the issues? How can you resolve them? But I think that, to me, the most important thing, which relates to our stewardship compass, the most important thing is to realize that we cannot ignore the long run.
That's right. Yeah.
And we see that the West is also failing in this many times. We see that many countries, many governments, but I have to be elected to do this. To be elected, you do things that are not necessarily in the interest of the long run.
More very short-term focused. And so it boils down to values then.
Yeah, it's values. It's ability to be convincing, because you have to have the people with you, and I think that it is patience, because at the end of the day, growth, development, success, whether it's environmental or any other success, is a result of a sacrifice.
That's right.
Today, you have to give up today something
to be able to build for the long term.
To build for the long run.
So my last question: the importance of institutions for economic growth at the country level is clear from your research.
Yeah.
What parallels can CEOs of businesses draw from that research?
It's interesting. I've talked over 15 years now about these institutions and growth, and several companies where I had talks after that said, we have adopted this in your framework in our company. And I think that at the end of the day, you can think about it in the following way. When I think about countries, some countries with the same amount of capital and the same amount of labor produce much more output than other countries with the same levels. So they have the same inputs, but they have more output because their productivity is higher. And when you ask the question, why is productivity higher? It is because the environment in which people operate, the institutions, as we say, are different. The same is true for companies. Some companies with the same capital and the same labor produce much more output. Why? It's because the culture, the organization that you have inside, what we call the institutions, the way that you structure everything in the exchange is just so much better. And I think that this is an interesting way to think about this, because when you think about the inputs, capital and labor, you can buy the same machines. You look at Apple, you can find the same machines that Apple has in order to produce. Actually, Apple is not even producing, they're outsourcing this. You can find, if their people are so good, you can poach some of them and get them. But if you don't have the culture, if you don't have the organization and the flows of ideas and the realization, that's not going to happen. So I think it's
similar.
The institutions at a different level,
At
at
the corporate level, exactly. And this corroborates very clearly with the research behind our book as well, that you mentioned the compass, that companies that are successful at doing well by doing good actually believe in interdependence, that the more I do for society, the more we will succeed. They do think long term. They think in generations, not in quarters and years. They take ownership that we are going to do business in a way that we are going to live 100 years and responsibly.
And I think that there will be even bigger beneficiaries in the times to come, because looking at the temperatures rises in the last year, which had several months with the highest temperature in the history since we have records. We are well above 1.5 degrees already. And it's just a matter of time before governments start actually imposing regulation, because they have to do it, otherwise. And or unions like the European Union imposing restrictions on imports unless you prove that you produce this in a sustainable way. I don't want to hear. I put tariffs that are penalizing. So companies that today are focusing on this, that are adjusting, the moment this thing comes,
they'll be in a better position. And those who are just milking the current cash cow business model and not investing enough in innovation are going to perish.
Yeah,
exactly. Very good. Very good. Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating conversation. And to our viewers, I hope it sheds some light on the environment in which businesses are operating, because the key question today is, in the 21st century, which is headlined by climate change, inequality, and both the opportunities and perils of technology, how do you seek profitable growth? And it seems from this conversation, the answer is definitely focus on today, but absolutely focus on tomorrow, because today's cash cow will run out or regulators will clamp on it. Ilian, thank you very much. And thanks once again for being on the show. It was lovely to have you.
Thank you, Rajeev. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.